All right, guys, so today we're going to talk about the Plymouth colony. We've talked a little bit about Jamestown, which was the first colony that the British set up in the New World. This is really the second. A lot of times, guys, in elementary school, we talk about the Pilgrims and Plymouth, and you think Thanksgiving, right? You might wear a hat similar to this, but really we're talking a little bit more beyond Thanksgiving. There's a lot more to the Plymouth colony than just the holiday at the end of November. So let's get started right away here. Really, you can't talk about Plymouth without talking about religion over in England. So in 1534, King Henry VIII broke away from the Catholic Church and formed a new Church of England. Some people were happy with this new church, some of them were not. And so really what you have now is multiple religions developing in the homeland of England. Some people wanted to separate from England and this new way of practicing religion and form their own. These people were generally called separatists. They wanted to separate from the old way of religious practices. The specific group, guys, that goes to the Plymouth colony were known as Puritans, right? They had a very pure way of life, very strict way of practicing their Christianity. Many of these separatists were persecuted, so originally they fled to the Netherlands. They come back. They're looking for places that they can have the same culture as being proud Englishmen, but still practice their religion the same. They couldn't do that in other parts of Europe, so they eventually decide that they're going to travel to the New World. So the Virginia Company, the same people that established the Jamestown colony that we talked about, really say, if you want to come to Jamestown, we will let you practice religion whichever way you want. Do your fair share of work, obviously give the joint stock company a little bit of your money, and you can practice whatever religion you want. So they called themselves Pilgrims because they were on a religious pilgrimage or a religious journey. So there's really three terms that people use to refer to these people. It is separatists, Puritans, and pilgrims. They all mean different things, but lots of times it's the same. They're used interchangeably. So you need to recognize that all three of those would be ways of referring to the people who went to the Plymouth colony. So they set sail on a ship called the Mayflower with 102 passengers on board in September 1620. Once again, this is your elementary school stuff that you should already have learned. So they reach land in November, but they're far north of their Jamestown target. I'll go over that a little bit on our next slide. They don't quite land where they're supposed to. Before going to shore, the passengers of the Mayflower signed the Mayflower Compact. And what the Mayflower Compact does is really establish both a religious society and actually a democratic form of government for them over here in this new world. The compact, like I said, sets up government and really tells us a lot about what their overall goals were and how they lived their life. So, Jamestown, as we discussed before, really is located right about here. And what you end up seeing is as the Mayflower comes to North America, they kind of stop right here. Okay, where they're actually heading is somewhat in this area, which still would have been considered Virginia, but they're really far north of that target, right? They're up here. So instead of continuing on, they basically just stop there. And so the second colony that Great Britain has really is here, okay? And you're going to see there's quite a bit of a difference between life in Jamestown and life in Plymouth, but we'll go over that more in class. So here's two quick little videos that actually are from Charlie Brown, one of the Charlie Brown holiday series. This one's from the Thanksgiving one, but really it's fun and simple, but it really gives you good information about the Pilgrims. So enjoy and make sure you watch this as I play it.
Date, September 6, 1620. Just 128 years since Columbus discovered America. The place, the harbor of Plymouth, England. A tiny ship called the Mayflower is being boarded by 102 people. There are 70 men and women, 32 children, a handful of cocks and hens and pets, and of the voyagers are people who today we call pilgrims. They are leaving their homeland to seek more religious freedom in the New World. Some of the passengers, known as strangers, are merely seeking wealth in the new land. Some are indentured servants, and the rest are the crew who will sail the Mayflower. The Pilgrims have a contract with English merchants who will finance the journey. The Pilgrims and the merchants will share any profits from the new settlement. This, however, is the most dangerous undertaking. The voyagers realize that their very lives are at risk. They must cross the treacherous North Atlantic in a very small ship. The journey will take many weeks on the open sea. Men, women, and children will be traveling in unbelievably crowded conditions, sharing what little space there is with the precious cargo. The voyagers will hardly have any room in which to sleep and eat, let alone move about. Many will be leaving loved ones behind. And even if they survive this dangerous crossing, they will arrive at a virtual wilderness. However, their belief in God, their desire for freedom from religious persecution, and their dreams of creating a new world for future generations all make their life-threatening journey a risk worth taking. Their adventures will change the course of American history. Terrible trip!
I've got a few choice words for the captain of this ship.
Good. The Mayflower has arrived. The date, November 9th, 1620. She first sights land 65 days and 2,750 miles from Plymouth, Devon. The average speed, 2 miles per hour. 2 days later, on November 11th, at 6:30 in the morning, they make their first landing at what today we call Provincetown Harbor. Because they have no charter or rules for the wilderness that stands before them, the Pilgrims write an historic agreement, which will eventually be called the Mayflower Compact. It establishes the plans for making the laws in the future. After an unsuccessful attempt to navigate further south, the Mayflower returns to Provincetown Harbor. The first group of men prepares to leave the ship and explore their new home. All the lone-weary passengers hope and pray that the worst is behind them. Of the original 102 passengers, 101 arrived, 2 having died in the crossing and 1 baby having been born. How many of these people will survive a winter in the wilderness is still in grave.
Okay, so the question really is, what is life like once they get there? So they arrive in early winter and they quickly make friends with a local Native American tribe called the Wampanoag. Sometimes Wampanoag, I usually say Wampanoag. They learned to plant crops, hunt, and fish from the Native Americans. And it's with them that they celebrate the first Thanksgiving that takes place in the autumn of 1621 to celebrate their friendship. Now, we don't know exactly the date that it took place. It was probably actually earlier in the fall than when we celebrate Thanksgiving. It wasn't uncommon for lots of different cultures to have some kind of harvest festival. But still, nonetheless, the tradition gets carried on in the United States today because of the Pilgrims at Plymouth. Now, just a little comprehension check. Where were the Puritans headed when they first set sail for America in 1620? Was it Plymouth? Was it Jamestown? Or was it Roanoke? And if you remember, guys, Roanoke was the colony that disappeared that we talked about briefly. Jamestown is where they were actually heading, okay? And Plymouth is where they end up. So the correct answer would have been B. Okay, so the colony expands, right? How is it that this little colony of 102 people grew to be, one of the most populated regions in North America? Well, in 1629, another group of Puritans received a royal charter to settle the area north of Plymouth, around what's currently Boston. During the period known as the Great Migration, 15,000 Puritans came and settled in the area. This became a huge religious society when more and more people from England came over to settle. Many cities began to develop into the area. Massachusetts was formed, the bigger area of Massachusetts. As Massachusetts expands, people began moving into Native American land, many times without permission. So here's kind of the part where that wonderful story you heard as kids about this friendship between the Native Americans and the Pilgrims really doesn't last forever. By 1636, there was really kind of hostility between the Puritans and the Native Americans, and it was simply because so many of them began to arrive. And by 1675, there was a war between the two called King Philip's War. King Philip was the nickname of the local Indian chief, so there was really no such thing as King Philip, but King Philip really was an Indian chief. And that war does not go well for the Native Americans. The English settlers really win the war, and it leads to an end of Native American culture in that particular region of the country. So really, in the end, the Wampanoag and their allies were defeated, and this really allowed the British to expand and have more and more people come throughout the area of New England. All right, so once again, just going back, looking at some comprehension checks. Which term is not used to describe settlers of the Plymouth colony in 1620? Separatists, Pilgrims, Puritans, Baptists. And the correct answer really is Baptists. Remember we talked about separatists. They wanted to separate from England, from religion in England. Pilgrims because they were on a religious journey, and Puritans because they practiced a more pure and strict form of Christianity. Baptists we didn't talk about at all. Okay, so really, although the Puritans left England for religious freedom, they criticized or persecuted people who had religious beliefs other than their own. People in New England weren't very tolerant of other religions. It's kind of hypocritical, which we'll talk more about in class, but you just have to keep in mind that because they were so strict in the way they practiced their religion, they expected other people who came to the colony to do the same thing. So as a result, many people left the Puritan-controlled Massachusetts Bay Colony and formed other nearby colonies. Anne Hutchinson was one, Thomas Hooker, Roger Williams. All of these people we'll talk more about in class. But what happens is they kind of go and form their own nearby little colonies, and Massachusetts really gets broken apart into smaller pieces. This is why today New England consists of a bunch of these little small states. Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire were all formed for this reason. And by 1680, there were really 4 successful, thriving New England colonies. And like I said, once again, they become very populated, and it forms into this one of 3 regions of the 13 colonies. Couple things to kind of think about, guys, as we go through, right? Which of these terms would kind of go with Jamestown, which would go with Plymouth. So we can look real quick. You know, the Powhatan tribe we talked about was definitely part of Jamestown, and the Wampanoag Indians really were more closer to Plymouth. King Philip's War we just talked about was more the Plymouth colonies. John Smith over here, Jamestown. Let's see, they grew tobacco, like we mentioned, in Jamestown. The Mayflower Compact really happened in Plymouth. The Virginia Company was the company that established Jamestown. Plymouth is located in New England. Guys, I know I'm going through this really fast. Jamestown starts off with just men only. Plymouth was founded for religious reasons. Separatists refer to the people in Plymouth, and the brackish water we talked about in the Jamestown DBQ. And one other thing, guys, before you are finished, is just keep in mind, right, what are some of these more differences? This is something you're going to fill out in class. Really start to think about how are Jamestown and Plymouth different, and what could that possibly lead to in the future. Don't forget your reflections, and I hope you fill out your margins. Thanks, guys.